Kaius is a professor of quantitative and comparative linguistics at the University of Helsinki, which is a position he started in March 2024. So I think congratulations are still just about in order. Um, and before that, he was the director of an ERC starting grant on GrammarDapt, if that's the right pronunciation, which I think was a very, very timely project, a very influential project in many ways, because it looked at the interaction between social linguistics and linguistic typology, and has really, been made a very strong contribution in that field, which I think is, it's one of the exciting new developments maybe over the last decade or so. So it combined typological and social linguistic approaches to language variation. And I think, the talk today also is partly comes out of that project. But more recently, very recently, since January, Kaius has been directing a research project at the University of Helsinki called Diversity in Society and Life, which is, very cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, brings together lots of arts and humanities and social sciences approaches, as well as natural sciences, biology, to look at diversity focused, I think, on Finland, but with wider theoretical methodological implications as well. So that just started. So we're looking forward also of outcomes of that, because linguistic diversity, I think, is a key element of this discussion. So it really talks to sister disciplines and other approaches. So it's really, really both timely and interesting. Kaius has published widely, including a paper, a very nice paper in our own Transactions of the Philological Society, a co-authored paper with Nura Ahola, which was part of the special issue Michele Bianconi and Robin Meyer edited. I think it was in 2023. And it was the Kaius's paper was on comparing Indonesian languages and language contact and how sorry, it's called testing inferences about language contact on morphosyntax. So it's contact and morphosyntactic variation across two different language families. It's a very nice paper. And of course, as members of the society, we all have free access to all papers in the transactions. But with that, let me not prevent Kaius from talking. His title today is Convergence and Divergence of Languages and Contact Ecologies, a Typological Approach. Thank you, Kaius, for joining us.
Thank you, and a warm thank you for the invitation to give this talk today, and thank you also, Lutz, for these welcoming words and introduction. So let me share my screen. There, and I'll hide the presenter view. So, okay, there. So, just one more piece of adjustment just for myself. There. Okay, good. So, maybe just a few words. Some of you may know a little bit of my research, but my background is mostly in language typology and a little bit in corpus linguistics. And so my background is not that much in historical linguistics, but over the years, I've become increasingly interested in historical linguistics, on language change, and especially now through this ERC starting grant that the project ended last year. So in that, we developed a typological approach to language contact. And this talk really quite directly draws from that. So I'm going to talk about convergence and divergence, more so about convergence, but divergence will be part of this also. So I'm going to organize the talk in this way. So a little bit background information about language contact research from my perspective as a typologist. Then I'm going to talk about the methodological approach we have developed, and then provide some preliminary results arising from this model based on our typological data. So we start with the background. So for this audience, I don't have to much explain about the background in language contact research, but maybe just to highlight a few things from here, that contact between human populations that use different languages, the more we know about this, it appears that contact has existed through human history and in prehistory. And various scenarios of bilingualism stem from these kinds of encounters, leading to different kinds of linguistic change, some increasing similarity between languages and some increasing dissimilarity or divergence between languages. Uriel Weinreich was probably the first to really provide and propose an analytical framework for researching the linguistic outcomes of language contact, and then Thomason and Kaufman strongly reinvigorated this research. So just schematically letting you know what I think about divergence and convergence. So if we think about divergence schematically in this way, that we have two languages that are whose, let's say, lexical structural distance is something at a point in time t1, and then at a later point in time their structural lexical distance becomes greater. So that's, for me, divergence. That's one way of looking at it. Convergence is where we have two languages that over time become more similar with one another, so their lexical structural difference becomes smaller. Divergence is something that, of course, has been of interest in the context of language contact also. But I would say less so than convergence. I just want to highlight here one particular research that I've found extremely interesting in the connection of my own research. So this is based on Mark Ellison's and Luisa Micheli's work, looking at mechanisms of lexical divergence in bilingual situations. So there's evidence in language monitoring that suggests that bilingual individuals, they avoid what is called doppels. So doppels are these words that have the same meaning and form in both of the languages that the bilinguals use. So for instance, photo in English and photo in Dutch. So what happens is that a bilingual tends to block these kinds of words in the non-target language to avoid activating both languages. So this is a mechanism that Ellison and Micheli propose for specifically for lexical divergence. We don't yet know whether this could be applied as such or in any way to structural divergence, but in any case, so this is the idea here, that we have an English-Dutch bilingual who in their English, there's the photo and picture, in the Dutch, photo. And when they are conversing with an English monolingual, they also have the option of using photo and picture. But because the English-Dutch bilingual, they share this doppel, the photo in English and the photo in Dutch. So they try to avoid activating Dutch when they are conversing with English monolingual. So rather than using the word photo, they would use picture. So this is a kind of way of explaining why in bilingual situations bilinguals may, at least in these kinds of contexts, create more divergence. But a little bit more about background from my perspective as a typologist. So one very interesting thing is the increasing attention given to research on language contact since something like 2010, which is obvious if we think about, for instance, the rise of the many handbooks on language contact published by the largest publishing houses that publish linguistics volumes. But even in the context of this emerging and increasing interest on contact research seems still mostly being based on case studies. And this kind of a comparative approach has been missing that we see in language typology, for instance. So Ad Bacchus said, well, this is already from 2014, and of course it's 10 years ago, things have changed, but he said that contact linguistics should not be very confident yet that data on a sufficient number of case studies have been amassed to know what is common and what is not. So that may be a little bit too bleak assessment, but still, I find it interesting that this kind of a typological approach has been missing. Another important aspect from my perspective has been that the focus in language contact research has mostly been on the linguistic outcomes of contact, rather than the social dynamics of bilingualism and how those may or may not play a role in how languages change. But there have also been increasing calls to take the social context more seriously. But that kind of research is slowly gaining momentum. But there have also been many proposals that, for instance, something like intensity or degree of language contact may impact how languages change in contact situations, going at least back to Thomas and Kaufman and more lately reinvigorated by Peter Druckill in his influential work. Now, this seems to somehow capture something that is attractive to many linguists. This idea of intensity of contact affecting language change in contact situations. But the problem is really how to measure this. And Thomason and Kaufman, for instance, proposed that one component there is time, that how long-term the contact has been, and the other component is that there's a strong structural pressure to a high level of bilingualism in a dominant language. And now we need to remember in this context that this is from the 1980s, and this is almost, well, 25, 30 years before researchers on smaller indigenous communities have started to talk about, for instance, small-scale multilingualism, which depicts often context situations where there is not this kind of a dominance relationship between the language communities, but rather equality. So these kinds of components of what degree of contact means, they need to be thought in a deeper way. So measuring degree of contact has been challenging. And we can think of two kinds of data that has been used for approaching degree of contact. And one is different kinds of socio-historical accounts that provide much useful qualitative data for assessing the social context of language contact. So, for instance, Walter Küsters and many others have used this kind of approach in their work. But from my perspective, it's kind of not satisfying that this kind of research that really looks at the rich socio-historical data still ends up categorizing that data into more or less binary feature values. So something like high or low contact, or like, for instance, in Walter Küster's very influential dissertation, he talked about type 1 and type 2 communities, where in type 1 communities, those are communities where the share of non-native speakers in the community is less than 50%, and in type 2 communities where the share of non-native speakers is more than 50%. So this is an interesting start, but it's a little bit unsatisfying to start building more on that. Now, of course, there have been sort of more large-scale typological approaches also, which have tended to use demographic data, so data on the number of speakers or the proportion of non-native speakers. And I think that research, which I also have been involved more in the past, less so during the past 2-3 years, has made a little bit of a splash in the context of sociolinguistic typology. But again, if we think about population size or the number of native speakers, proportion of non-native speakers, especially the proportion of non-native speakers, the data is very difficult to come by. And it's still very unclear, for instance, in terms of the number of native speakers, that what kind of predictions we could reasonably make about language change as a function of something like that. So this is just to show you two graphs from my own research together with Francesca Di Garbo from several years ago, where we used this kind of demographic data to assess whether morphological complexity of the verb seemed to be affected by such features. So there seem to be these unresolved questions here when we think about the extent that sociolinguistic environment may impact language change across context scenarios. So to solve that question, we actually first need to solve quite many other questions. For instance, how to assess the linguistic outcomes of contact across the context scenarios, so in a typological way. Another one is how to measure, for instance, something like degree of contact across these bilingual or multilingual scenarios. And the solution that we propose is to adapt methods from language typology, but not only from language typology, including many other sister fields that I'm soon going to tell more about. So this research has grown, as mentioned already, in the context of my ERC's starting grant project that finished last summer. So the focus in that project was on linguistic adaptation, and we applied that idea to the context of language contact. And we proposed this comparative approach to researching language change in contact situations. And there are many bits and pieces of this methodological approach, including a new typological sampling tool, then a typological model to evaluate the linguistic outcomes of contact that we published last year, then this sort of evaluation of our model that we published in the Transactions of the Philological Society, as Lutz mentioned. And then just recently, I think it was last week, was online published design principles for analyzing the social aspects of language contact. So this paper on the design principles of a sociolinguistic typological questionnaire for language contact research. So it's an unusual journal article. The article itself is something like 50 pages, and then including on top of that the questionnaire and its explanation, which is another 50 pages. But you can find it openly accessible online. So these are the people that I've been collaborating with, mostly with postdocs Francesca Di Garbo, Ricardo Napola de Souza, and Eric Kashima, who no longer are in Helsinki. Actually, Ricardo is now in Helsinki. He was in Edinburgh for 2 years, but he's back in Helsinki. And we are, of course, extremely grateful for many collaborators that we've been able to collaborate with over the years in this project, who filled out, for instance, our social contact questionnaire. Okay, that much about the background, and then I'm going to tell more about the methodological approach step by step. So first about the sampling for contact. So let's start with this assumption that we have two populations that use different languages. So we have group one, and let's call this their language. Focus language, for instance, Alorese, which is an Austronesian language spoken in eastern Indonesia on the islands of Bantar and Alor. And then group two, let's call their language neighbor language, for instance, Adang, which is a Papuan language, more specifically Timor Alor Bantar language, spoken also on the islands of, mostly on the island of Alor. And there has been contact between these languages. So our test case is this contact between the focus language and neighbor language. And then the question from a typological perspective, and not only from a typological perspective, but more generally, that if we know that there has been social contact between these language communities, And there seems to be some evidence that the focus language may have changed and become more similar with the neighbor language in the course of contact. How do we validate if that apparent similarity between these languages has resulted from language contact or not? So that's sort of a fundamental question. And of course, ideally, we would use historical data for this. So to collect data from several points in time, especially for the focus language predating the contact with the neighbor language. Of course, the challenge there is that we just don't have that kind of data for most languages in the world. We have that kind of data mostly available for the elite, for the languages spoken by the elites of large empires or kingdoms, but not for many indigenous languages or most. Reconstruction is another way of validating that this increased similarity between the focus and neighbor has come from contact. So we use synchronic data from related languages to reconstruct pre-contact patterns. And this is, of course, possible, but the challenge there is that to really find data, sufficient data, means that either there's a lot of work, we need to collect data on so many different languages that are related to the focus language to arrive at reconstructions, and the reconstruction work takes a lot of time. Or if we rely on existing reconstructions, as for instance Ilya Cezanne has done in his recent work, then we are limited to only well-researched variables like person marking on the verb. There are other approaches also, sociolinguistic approaches like apparent time construct and probably other approaches also, but all of these have more or less similar problems, either related to availability of data or enormous workload if we want to do a comparative approach. Now, if we think about these three types, historical data, reconstruction, and the other approaches, I think what these try to do, reconstructions try to approximate historical data. And also the sociolinguistic approaches try to approximate or simulate having data points from different points in time. So we build on this idea, and our proposal is that we select contact pairs, so the test case pairs, such as Aloris and Adang. And there are a few criteria here that we use. So one is that there's attested social contact between the focus and neighbor groups. Another one is that the focus and neighbor languages are unrelated, so that we can, at least at this initial stage in our approach, to rule out the fact that the similarity between the contact languages would have arisen from genealogical relationship. Then we propose, this is a bold proposal, but something that we have implemented and also started testing and validating, is that we need a control case. We don't have historical data for many languages. We can't do reconstructions, but we propose that we can start by selecting just a single benchmark language that works as a control case for making inferences about the contact between the focus and neighbor. So the benchmark is related to the focus, but outside the contact scenario of the focus-neighbor contact. Now, this approach is expandable to more benchmarks and more neighbors. And we propose that using a single benchmark may approximate reconstructions. And I'll show some preliminary results that go towards validating that also. Of course, we could use more benchmarks, but we make the claim that one benchmark could be enough. And if it appears in the longer run that one benchmark is not enough, that there would be too many false positives, then this kind of typological approach could still be expanded and improved. Now, one thing here, what we sort of the claim here is that the control case, the benchmark language, sort of approximates what the state of the focus language was before its contact with the neighbor. Okay, so key components in this proposal is that we need a benchmark, and this has been proposed also in variations research by several people. And that one benchmark may be sufficient for large-scale comparative purposes. Otherwise, we would need more resources to build a sample that would have maybe 2, 3, or 5 benchmarks. The model, this approach is also built on 2 different terms in typology that we have incorporated into our model. One is that language context is about language change. So it's not about language states. So we turn from the distribution of types or states to distribution of type shifts. And this is something that Joe Greenberg already proposed in 1978, but it was only in 2000 that Elena Maslova implemented this in language typology, and then others have built on that. The other one is that language contact is relational, that we turn from seeing languages as sort of these islands as absolute reference points for contact to focusing on specific contact relations. So rather than saying that we are looking at how Aloris, for instance, was affected by language contact in general, we shift the focus to researching that how Aloris was affected by contact with a specific language here, namely Adam. This is our language sample, so we have sampled 50 sets of these. So we always sample languages in these bundles of 3 languages, and we have roughly 50 sets of these 3 bundles, so 150 languages in total. Okay, let's talk about the variable design next. So this is about the linguistic variables. So we collect data on 5 broad domains that some are phonological, like syllable structure and word prosody systems. Others are morphosyntactic, such as nominal number and adnominal possession, and then some semantic lexical morphosyntactic, such as adnominal demonstratives. We specifically focus on structural patterns rather than matter. The model can, of course, be extended to include matter kind of matter borrowing, but we focus on patterns here. And the research material comes mostly from grammar descriptions and other descriptive work rather than primary data collection. Some assumptions we also make that are related to what is called multivariate typology in the field of language typology is that contact-induced changes may often start out locally in some parts of language, restricted to subparts of the grammar or the lexicon, and they first may be optional and only gradually becoming obligatory if they become obligatory, and gradually extend into other parts of language if they extend to begin with. So capturing language internal variation sort of in this way necessitates that we look at language in not just sort of overall types of, for instance, of word order or something like that, but we try to capture language internal variation. And we argue that this is suitable for identifying contact effects and analyze more than 25 features per these five domains, altogether perhaps more than 200 features. So just a small example from possessive noun phrases. So these are constructions that semantically express ownership, partner relations, kinship relations, such as my bike, the girl's bike, the brakes of the bike. And in these constructions, the possessor is the syntactic dependent and the possessum is the syntactic head. And we analyze several features in these constructions that enable analyzing the domain internal variation related to possessive noun phrases. So one of these aspects is locus of marking that comes from Johanna Nichols's work. So the idea here is that the syntactic relationship between the head and dependent in possessive noun phrases, is it morphologically marked in some way, for instance, via genitive case? And if it is, where does that morphological marking exist? Like, is it on the dependent, such as in the Finnish example here, naapurin talo, where there is genitive case and the dependent is marked, or if the morphological marking is on the head, such as in Hungarian, possessive suffix on the head here, or such as in standard Finnish, there's marking on both the dependent and the head. So this is double marking, or there's no marking. So these are the main types. There are some minor types, but I'm not going into that detail here. So besides locus of marking, we are looking at things like alienability. So for instance, Adang uses head marking for inalienable possession. So there's a prefix on the head, but Adang uses dependent marking for alienable possession. So there's a suffix on the dependent here in this case. We also look at word order. So Aloris uses genitive noun word order, whereas Mangarai, which is closely related to Aloris, uses genitive noun genitive word order. And then also it uses an independent genitive marker rather than genitive case or eclectic, but this is more like an independence particle. So we take into account these dimensions of variation. So a little bit about assessing our model, especially the idea that is a single benchmark sufficient? So in our paper that we published in the Transactions of the Philological Society, we presented a case study on the concept in Aloris and Adang, and this is why I keep on referring to these languages, because we analyze a lot of data from them. So instead of analyzing just one benchmark for this context scenario, we analyzed data from 20 alternative benchmarks and focused on possessive noun phrases, analyzing more than 100 binarized features. So what we did here is we used Bayesian ancestral state reconstruction to estimate what the value of each feature related to possessive noun phrases was in the branch root, for instance. So for instance, here we have data on the word order between the genitive and noun. So the feature here is whether the language has genitive noun word order, and Central Lembata Levokukun has that word order and Eastern Atadei has it, but the other languages in this set do not. And then through Bayesian ancestral state reconstruction, we can reconstruct for different branches here the probability that there is a genitive noun word order in this language. And then for word order, for instance, genitive noun, rather than just analyzing the feature for one single benchmark, we analyze also the data for the different branch roots in the tree. And what we do is we then compare what kinds of inferences with these 140 binarized features. So when we use just a single benchmark, Lama-Holot in this case, which gives us certain kinds of inferences about contact between Aloris and Adang, and then we compare what kinds of inferences about convergence we get when we use these ancestral state reconstructions. And then we compare these inferences to one another and see whether the inferences using only a single benchmark deviates significantly from those using ancestral reconstructions. And I was actually a little bit surprised that the results were so clear that there was actually no evidence suggesting that when using a single benchmark, that those inferences about convergence would somehow deviate from those inferences when we use ancestral state reconstructions. So we argue that this is a way of at least partially starting to validate our approach of using just a single well-selected benchmark for making inferences about contact. Maybe I should just briefly explain why Lamaholot. So let me just go back quickly. So Lamaholot, why we selected that. So Aloris is spoken on the island of Pantar and Alor, and Lamaholot is spoken on the islands west to it. And what we know about Aloris is that the population migrated from one of these islands to the islands of Pantar and Alor, not less something like 600 years ago. So it's 600 years ago that they migrated from when they spread off from Lamaholot. So that gives us an interesting point of comparison for these inferences about language contact. So let's then talk about how we make these inferences about language contact. So the starting point is that how similar the focus and neighbor languages are in terms of each variable, and how do they compare against the benchmark, the control data. So this is a schematic way for us to understand how we make these inferences. So here we have the focus language on the first line, neighbor language, benchmark, and then F1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can think about them as schematic features, binary features with yes, no values. So when the focus, neighbor, and benchmark each share the same feature value, we call that mesh. We just can't distinguish whether this similarity is because of inheritance or because of language contact or something else. We just can't tell. So we use this term mesh, borrowing that from Mike Fortescue, his earlier work. Then these cases where the focus and benchmark share the same feature value, which is different from the neighbor. So we argue that these provide us with cases of inheritance. When the focus and neighbor share a feature value which is different from benchmark, this is a case of convergence, whether there's shared presence of features or shared absence of features. And then the final case is really interesting, where the focus is different from the neighbor and benchmark. So we call this divergence. So this schematic approach makes it possible for us to compare, for instance, the rates of convergence and divergence in interesting ways. So for convergence, we focus on these cases where the neighbor and benchmark have different values. So the idea here is that the focus could have become similar with the neighbor, and then we look at whether it has or hasn't. So we have three possibilities where the focus could have become more like neighbor, and then we have two similarities where it seems to have become more like neighbor. So our convergence score here, or similarity score, is 2 out of 3. Now, how to assess divergence here? This is not really clear yet how this should be done. So with convergence, we start with when benchmark and neighbor are different and assess the focus against the neighbor. With divergence, we could start by focusing on just those cases where benchmark and neighbor are similar, and then assess the focus against the neighbor. So this would mean comparing the mesh and divergence to one another. So for instance, in this case, we have sort of two possibilities and one dissimilarity, so that this divergence score or dissimilarity score would be 1 out of 2. Maybe I'll just very quickly go through this first example. So for instance, in benchmark, we have here noun genitive word order. In the neighbor language, we have genitive noun word order, and the focus language has genitive noun word order also. So for this particular feature, thus we would make an inference that this is evidence for convergence. Here, the particular form, first person singular pronoun form, is the same in the benchmark and focus, but different in neighbor. So this would be a case of inheritance. And here, whether there's dependent marking or not in the possessive noun phrase, so in benchmark and neighbor there is, but in the focus there is, so the focus diverges from both. Maybe just very briefly about the shared presence versus absence. So does the presence of the shared absence provide the same kind of evidence as shared presence of features? We make the assumption, at least for this typological approach, that yes, it does. Otherwise, we would have to qualify or weigh the shared absence of features somehow, and there are not necessarily any principled ways of doing that. But also, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that there are textbook examples of sort of shared absence of features. So if we think about, for instance, Armenian, so in contact with Turkic, Armenian lost adjective-noun agreement. It also lost noun-adjective order. So are these just innovations that happened in Armenian, perhaps because of simplification or something like that? Maybe. But then when we look at what Turkic has, so Turkic doesn't have adjective-noun agreement and noun-adjective order. So we could as well just make the case that Armenian became more like Turkic here, but it became like it in the sense that it started sharing absence of these particular features. So one of the things here we want to build a mathematical model about assessing the probability of convergence with our approach. But if we just look at these similarity scores, it doesn't really make that much sense just to look at them or even turn them into a decimal. That makes even less sense. So intuitively, if we say that if we have a case like 15 out of 25 data points provides evidence for convergence, somehow intuitively that's stronger evidence if in another setting we have 3 features out of 5 that provide evidence for contact. But if we turn these into decimals, both are 0.6. So somehow we would like to tap the intuition that the 15 out of 25 provides stronger evidence for contact. And the way we do this is that we apply what is called the beta distribution. Beta distribution turns fractions, such as 15 out of 25, into continuous probability distributions. And, excuse me, with these continuous probability distributions, we can then assess this uncertainty. So the yellow line here represents the 15 out of 25 case. So you can see that its 95% confidence interval is much narrower than for the 3 out of 5 case, which is represented by the blue line here, which has a rather wide margin. So this helps us to tap this intuition and also build this measuring uncertainty into our model. So let's look at some results, and then we go into the social aspects of contact. So first this. So here we have probability of convergence on the y-axis, then the different domains, number, possession, and so on the x-axis. But how do we compute these box plots? So the procedure is the following. First, we compute the similarity scores. So the fractions for each language. How many features out of, for instance, 25, such as evidence for convergence. Then we turn these scores into probability distributions for each language. Then we sample once from each of these language-specific probability distributions. Then we aggregate by taking the mean across those one probability from each distribution. We take the mean, and then we repeat this 10,000 times. So we then get these probability distributions. So for instance, for number, the probability of convergence is around 0.4. And conversely, the probability of stability or inheritance would be 1 minus the probability of convergence. So that would be something like 0.56. So we can draw these sorts of inferences. So for syllable structure and prosody, the probability of convergence seems to be slightly greater than 0.5, but in the other three domains, less than 0.5, and the overall probability of convergence is somewhere around 0.44. So there's still, if we think about that, these cases, these contact scenarios that we have here, they represent cases where we know that there has been at least some contact between these languages, but still the probability of convergence is not more than 0.4. And this is something that earlier typological research has also suggested, although not applying this similar methodology. Then we can also plot the probability of convergence across languages. So here are the 50 languages, those in red where the median probability is less than 0.5, those with red where the median probability is greater than 0.5. So notice that alories, the probability of that alories has converged to Adang is something like 80%, which if you think that we have quite many features here from 5 different linguistic domains and 600 years since alories split off from Lama Holot, it has become almost like Adang in terms of these many features related to these 5 linguistic domains. So I won't spend more time here, just raising your curiosity. Then what we can do, we can compare the probability of divergence and convergence. So the probability in this graph here represents the probability of divergence. So the greater the probability of divergence, the smaller the probability of convergence is. So what we can make from this, there's actually quite a bit of variation here across these 5 linguistic domains. In terms of the phonological features, syllable structure and lexical prosody, in both the probability of divergence is less than the probability of convergence. And for all features, the probability of divergence is around 0.46. The probability of convergence, therefore, is around 0.54. And for me, this suggests that these probabilities for divergence and convergence are fairly similar. And this, when I did this the first time for the smallest data set and for smaller sample, this struck me as highly interesting. That why is the probability of divergence this large? Okay. I don't have too much time. I'm probably a little bit over time already, so I'm going through the social dynamics of contact next, and maybe skipping a few things here. So we developed a questionnaire to collect data on the social dynamics of contact. First, reviewing literature, developing more than 200 questions pertaining to the dynamics of social interactions between the language communities. We didn't just develop these questions sort of overall, but mostly asking them in relation to 6 social domains, namely family and kin, trade, labor, and so on. And these judgments were based on observations of the respondents during their fieldwork. So we developed the questionnaire and then asked specialists who know these contact situations well to respond to the questionnaire. So we had questions, predetermined answers that were informed by literature on multilingualism, anthropological linguistics, second language learning, and many other related fields. Many of the predetermined answers were on 5-point Likert scale. Some were categorical, and we also gave the opportunity to provide comments. So we can use this data set to try to approach what we could perhaps mean with intensity of contact. So rather than trying to answer that directly, we break it down into more fine-grained bits and pieces and then aggregate bottom up in different ways. So there's this work from the 70s by Nat Gardner, who proposed these concepts of intensive bilingualism and extensive bilingualism, and this is something that we can use our data to approximate these. So intensive bilingualism is that members of the focus group are frequently exposed to neighbor language. So what this says is that not necessarily everyone is frequently exposed, but at least some of the members. And we have data on this, that how often do the focus people, for instance, work with the neighbor people? And we repeat the question in the other social domains also. Now, extensive bilingualism is defined this way, that many members of the focus group are exposed to the neighbor language. So this is about how many members of the focus group are exposed, but it doesn't ask about how much they are approached, so how frequently they are exposed to neighbor language. So we have also a question related to this, that what is the proportion of the total focus people who have opportunities for contact with the neighbor people in the different 6 social domains. Other relevant variables are that what language is used in these interactions between the focus and neighbor people. So our options are focus language, neighbor language, some other language, and then this is highly contextual depending on the situation, referring mostly to these situations of small-scale multilingualism. And then another one, that how important language is to the focus group identity, ranging from very insignificant to very significant. So we can build on earlier work and come up with a hypothesis that the more important language is to the focus group identity, the less likely the focus language is going to converge to the neighbor language. And we can test this with our data. So these are the sociolinguistic parameters that we model. Let's go to the results and then the summary. So this is about convergence. So the probability of convergence and correlating that with our social contact features. These are based on rank correlations, but our results with using ordinal regression are very similar. So first of all, which language is used? So the way that we measure this here is that if the focus people use the neighbor language, they are more likely to converge. The focus language is more likely to converge to the neighbor language. And there seems to be a fairly strong correlation, positive correlation there. Then the intensive bilingualism is also supported. There's a significant correlation. So the more intense the bilingualism is, the more the focus language will converge to the neighbor language. Extensive bilingualism, there's no significant correlation. And very interestingly, the probability of convergence correlates negatively with language identity. So that confirms the hypothesis that the stronger, the more important the focus language is to the focus group identity, the less the language will converge to the neighbor language. Then with regard to divergence, the other features, which language is used, doesn't correlate with the probability of divergence. Language attitudes don't correlate with the probability of divergence. They also don't correlate with probability of convergence. But the language identity here, again, there's a negative correlation. So the more important language is to the focus group identity. The more the focus language diverges from the neighbor. So that's highly interesting also. So just to conclude briefly, that this proposed model makes it possible to make typological inferences about the probability of convergence, but also the probability of divergence. And we can compare these across the linguistic domains across languages. There are still problems, some residue false positives, but we would need more data to address those. The probability of convergence seemed to correlate positively with intensive bilingualism, but not with extensive bilingualism. Also positively with the language that was used, namely whether the neighbor language was used. So then the focus tended to be converged with the neighbor language, and also negative correlation with language identity. So some hypotheses were confirmed, some disconfirmed. And as a summary, the claim that we make based on our research is that we believe that language typology offers interesting and promising tools for building this kind of a systematic approach that we can use to evaluate the linguistic outcomes of contact, but also the social dynamics of contact. And this makes it possible to start approaching sort of building a bottom-up model for answering these long-standing questions in language contact research, that whether for instance, the probability of change is greater if there's very intense contact between the languages. Okay, thank you for your attention.